What comes to mind when you hear the word indigenous? Does it look something like this? And when you see these images, what words would you use to describe the visual? In what ways do you associate these images with assumptions, thoughts, or ideas about who these people are? The idea of the indigenous is a very interesting one that has come about through a lengthy historical and political process. Language is so limiting that it's hard for anyone, even anthropologists, to explain what the indigenous is. Often, assumptions or generalizations are made. My project will focus on the construction of the indigenous identity in the Ecuadorian Amazon, looking at how the indigenous has been constructed, manipulated, and politicized in the Ecuadorian Amazon through language, by looking at how international media sources and the indigenous groups themselves have used their unified indigenous identity as a political force to fight for rights in the Ecuadorian Amazon in response to environmental destruction. Is this politicization of identity a good thing, since there have been positive outcomes as a result? Or has some aspect of identity been lost or damaged in the process? I will seek to explore these questions further. Let's go down to the northeastern Ecuadorian Amazon where this story begins. First, you will need some background information. In the late 1960s, Texaco Chevron began extracting oil from the northeastern region of the Ecuadorian Amazon, inciting a highly contentious and ongoing legal battle between the oil industry, the Ecuadorian government, and the indigenous populations of the region. The oil extraction, in addition to the widespread deforestation and infrastructural development on indigenous-owned land, has disrupted the livelihoods of many communities and has led to serious health complications, pollution of natural resources, and human rights abuses. So who am I talking about when I say the indigenous? Well, to be specific, I'm talking about the Guarani and Quechua tribes, which are highly distinct groups living in the northeastern region of the Amazon in the Napo and Pastaza provinces. Both of these groups have been highly involved in the oil disputes in the past few decades. However, media sources often do not distinguish between the different tribes in the Amazon and simply call them indigenous. While this is often an oversimplification, there is perhaps some significance to using the term indigenous as one all-encompassing word. The notion of the indigenous came about as a result of neoliberal political reform in the 1980s. This is complicated, and I won't go into too much detail, but in the 1980s, indigenous people were more or less left alone. This was relatively inadvertent, meaning that the government didn't specifically try to grant indigenous groups autonomy, but they had it, more or less. And then, in the 1980s, the government decided that they would open up the Amazon and the country to a free market and neoliberal reform, meaning that the Amazon region was more or less commodified. This meant that oil companies were now allowed to buy and sell the land that had once been owned by indigenous groups. Many argue that neoliberal reform politicized ethnic cleavages, meaning that there was a newfound sense of being indigenous that came about as distinct groups began to work together to fight for their rights as indigenous people, rather than rural poor or some other identifying factor. This led to massive indigenous protests in the early 1990s, which brought together Andean and Amazonian groups under one umbrella. This became known as an organization called CONAI. This is all relevant to show that the idea of being indigenous has taken on a political connotation. The development of the indigenous has been highly intertwined with the developing oil politics in the region. So, in the early 1990s, as international forces caught wind of the happenings in Ecuador, a lawsuit emerged in the United States, suing Texaco Chevron on behalf of approximately 80 indigenous communities in the affected area. The focus of my paper will be to explore the way that Texaco Chevron lawsuit and the ensuing legal complications in the past decade have served as a platform for the discursive and linguistic politicization of indigenous identity by the international sphere and the local people themselves. I will do this by looking at documentaries and YouTube videos to see how the visual and linguistic are linked to create a particular conception of the indigenous that triggers emotions and assumptions on the part of the viewer, ultimately serving to disempower the groups and problematize understandings of how these groups truly exist by depicting them as vulnerable, savage, in need, impoverished, and desperate, when this is not always the case. Words like disgraceful, third world human beings, ethnic, and tribal are all implicated in this visual and linguistic discourse. The West has made the indigenous a social and humanitarian cause. This conception has, on the one hand, pushed legislation forward and engendered political gains, but on the other hand, it has really limited future opportunities for more complete understanding on the anthropological side of what these Texaco-Chevron disputes have meant for indigenous communities. I plan to frame my argument through an anthropological lens, focusing specifically on the discursive construction of indigeneity, starting with Edward Said's work on Orientalism and moving towards conceptions of the indigenous, discourse on the indigenous, and international conceptions of the indigenous, to ground the idea of othering through language that occurs in the media in the Texaco-Chevron case. To focus on the linguistic side, I am hoping to be able to draw on readings from class to think about the limits of language itself in creating this sense of the indigenous in the media sources, but I am having trouble thinking of how to do this. The conclusions I've drawn so far are that, first, Texaco-Chevron's involvement in international media was an integral platform on which the indigenous of the Ecuadorian Amazon was constructed in a discursive and visual way. Second, this manipulation of indigeneity by media sources has served to disempower indigenous communities through the words and images that depict them. 3. This ultimately serves a negative purpose because it perpetuates a simplified conception of people that serves to other and distance them, although there may be positive legal gains from the international attention. So my questions for you are, how can I apply a linguistic framework from class to this argument? Also, how could I make the theory better in general? Do you think that the focus is too broad? How could I narrow it down if so? And should I bring newspaper articles in addition to the videos, or is this enough? And do you have any other ideas or conclusions that I may be able to draw, or any other directions that I should explore? Thank you for listening.